preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Ariella Stokin. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the 92nd Street Y this evening for tonight's session of the Jewish Literary Exchange. We are delighted to have Jonathan Safran Foer here to discuss Everything is Illuminated, and of course Dr. Margot Krebs, our facilitator for this series. Two quick program notes. The first is regarding our next session. We are going to have Liz Swados here. The original date was March 12th, but we've moved that up to February 12th. A couple of people mentioned that they were having trouble getting the book, that it was sold out on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Why don't you see me afterwards, and I'll take down your name and number, and I'll see if I can work something out through the publisher to get you folks the books. The other thing is a thank you to the Jewish Book Council, who is co-sponsoring this evening. Thank you for coming, and enjoy the evening.
Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Jonathan, to you. Welcome. It's lovely to meet you finally. You have quite a crowd. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So, my legal name is Alexander Perchov. That is how the book begins, reminiscent of that great American epic, Moby Dick. Everything is Illuminated is a mock epic, I think, a picaresque tale, not the search for the great whale, but the search for Augustine, a different kind of truth. It's the story of two narrators, young American Jonathan Safran Foer, who comes to Ukraine in search of Augustine, a woman who saved his grandfather from the Nazis, and Alex, a young Ukrainian who is to serve as his interpreter. Well, told this way, the tale seems awfully simple, and it is far from simple. In reality, it's made up of two strands, connected by a third, a kind of braid, if you will. Alex tells the story of the search, the journey to the town of Trachtenbrod and its environs. Jonathan Safran Foer, who has returned to America empty-handed, no Augustine, no real traces of her, writes an imaginative fictional chronicle of Trachtenbrod and of his ancestor Brod. The third strand is made up of the letters Alex writes to Jonathan, commenting on both their manuscripts. It's very interesting that Jonathan never replies. We only hear that one voice, that one side of the story. I understand that you took a trip to the Ukraine one summer, and I guess this was the inspiration for the novel, In Search of Your Family Roots. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Was it similarly futile?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for coming. Was it similarly futile? In a way, I don't think the trip in the book was futile, and my trip in life wasn't futile. In both cases, what I was looking for was not found. But I think I realized after I made the trip, I was 19 when I made the trip, and I went to the Ukraine for 3 days. And I had a photograph of my grandfather with a woman who I had been told saved him during the war. And I thought when I made the trip, when I embarked on the trip at least, that I was looking for this woman. Mm-hmm. And it was clear immediately upon disembarking the train that there was no chance I was going to find her. I mean, absolutely no chance whatsoever. And so the destination of the thing that I was looking for started to change. And it turned out, as sort of fruity as it might sound, that the book was what I was looking for, the book that I wrote, that act of expression and of figuring out where I came from, who I was, and where I was going to go.
Mm-hmm. And so it was far from futile.
But you have to change your definitions around.
Right. Did you have a guide and an interpreter as colorful as the ones that you gave us here?
No, I had a guide whose name was Alex, and I think his name might have even been Alexander Perchov. I can't remember. And as I was writing the book, it occurred to me periodically that, oh God, if this is the person's real name, that would be really horrible. And I even remember before the book was published, the publishing house sends you a questionnaire, the legal department does, and they say, is there anybody with this name? Is there anybody with this name? You know, in the event that you're sued, then I guess I'm liable.
Disclaimer.
So I said no, because I didn't think so. But in fact, there might be. And if so, I hope that he feels sympathetically toward his character as I do. But the person who was my guide on the trip spoke perfect English, and I had absolutely no friendship with him afterward.
Well, I imagine if there were, you would have heard from him, because I understand that the book is highly acclaimed in Europe and on bestseller lists. I don't know if there's a bestseller list in Odessa, but who knows? I mean,
I
maybe.
think there's a best stolen list, maybe.
Well, you chose as one of your heroes your own namesake. How come?
This is one of those questions that I'm much more curious about other people's answers than my own. In large part, there's a saying that I really love, which is that an ant is not an entomologist. And I think what it means is, in order to do something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you understand why you're doing it or that you could describe why you're doing it. Plenty of things, like I'm drinking coffee because I was out of town last night. I came in on a plane and I'm sort of tired, and coffee always feels really wonderful to my body for some reason that I could not possibly describe. You know, a biologist could describe it, a doctor could describe it. Nevertheless, I enjoy coffee. And the process of writing the book was a lot like that, in that I was making all sorts of decisions without necessarily understanding them, but knowing that they had to do with who I was. One of those decisions was using my name as the name of one of the protagonists in the book. And even now I can apply reasons to why I might have done it, but I don't feel like I'm the expert of the decision, and I don't even necessarily feel that I'm any more expert than somebody who read the book rather than wrote the book.
Okay, then you won't mind, because I have all kinds of interpretations for this book. And I was going to ask you if it's all right.
I'm an expert about other people's opinions.
Thanks for the warning. All right, well, since Alex is what he calls fluid in English, his writing is hilarious. He signs his letters guilelessly. He introduces himself as a premium person. He boasts about being carnal with many girls, and sometimes he finds himself caught, quote, amid a rock and a rigid place. So I think it's only fair to let him have his own voice, so I want to read a little bit from Alex. It was little Igor's 14th birthday yesterday. He made his arm broken the day yore because he fell again, this time from a fence he was hiking on, if you can believe it. We all tried very inflexibly to make him a happy person. And Mother prepared a premium cake that had many ceilings, and we even had a small festival. Grandfather was present, of course. He inquired how you are, and I told him that you would be reverting to university in September, which is now. I did not inform him about how the guard stole Augustine's box, because I knew that he would feel ashamed, and it made him happy to hear of you, and he is never happy. He wanted for me to inquire if it would be a possible thing for you to post another reproduction of the photograph of Augustine. He said that he would present you currency for any expenses. I'm very distressed about him, as I informed you in the last letter. His health is being defeated. He does not possess the energy to get spleened often, and is usually in silence. In truth, I would favor it if he yelled at me, and even if he punched me. In the process of telling the story, Alex comes across as soft-hearted, honorable, and sensitive. He seeks truth and purity, and idealizes love and wants happy endings. Alex's story is funny, witty, and in some ways a rite of passage. But it is Jonathan's story, his fictional chronicle, the history from 1791 to the Holocaust, that provides the lyrical world, the dizzy world, at the center of your novel. It has been compared to the paintings of Chagall and his magical view of shtetl life. Do you think the comparison is apt?
I think it's apt, but it's sort of easy. It's kind of like saying, you know, that a great, no, let me take that back. It's sort of like saying that, God, there's no way to say this without sounding ridiculous, but it's just, I don't think it, and now I have to avoid the word illuminates too because it's in the title of my book, but I don't think it illuminates anything because of course Chagall was painting about a similar subject matter and of course he was painting with a somewhat similar style, which is to say very folkloric, very colorful, very energetic, and very imagined rather than realistic. So in a way it's sort of, it's like saying this cream cheese tastes like cream cheese, you know, rather than this cream cheese tastes like Rome or something really unusual where you think about it and you say, oh, actually that's true, and that makes me think about cream cheese in a different way. And I just came from France, that's where I was, and the cover of my book is a Kandinsky painting. And my publisher there was saying to me that a lot of people were initially turned off by the idea of, oh, this is a sort of novel where rabbis are flying around and it's sort of like Chagall. And the publisher said, no, I think it's a lot more like Kandinsky. And somebody said, ah, yes, this now is interesting to me because Chagall everybody knows and you know what you're getting, and the literary equivalent, the musical equivalent are sort of already exhausted. But so I guess that analogy doesn't go so far with me.
Okay, how about let's try this one, Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Same thing. Well,
don't you know that this is magic realism?
No, of course I know. I was in Prague when I wrote the book, and I was reading Love in the Time of Cholera when I wrote the book. And it was the first book I ever read, and probably the only book I've ever read in my entire life whose ending I really regretted. I really did not want it to end. And that experience, I think even more than imitating the style of his writing, I felt that I wanted to imitate the purpose of his writing, which was to be such good company to a reader that the end was a kind of sadness.
But why this way? There must be something about the style that attracted you.
Well, I was a very young writer when I wrote the book, and I think it's extremely difficult to approach reality directly, and I think it maybe gets easier the more experience you have with reality. And in the position that I was coming from, it was easier to say, this is what it's like. You know, maybe the feeling that this evokes is like the feeling that my reality evokes, rather than to say, here are the facts of my life and here are the names and numbers of my life. You know, little children are the most imaginative people on earth. Much more so. I think life almost traces an arc of losing all of your imagination. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, because as you lose your imagination, you come into a kind of intelligence and wisdom about, well, this is the practicality of the world, and here's how I can actually participate in it and function and not need the help of my parents. But at that point in my life, I was almost at a break, I think, between those two understandings of the world, one of which being very romantic and full of wonder and thinking that anything was possible, anything I tried to do, I could do. And then the understanding that I came into, which I now have, which is, it's not true that anything's possible, and it's not true that I can do anything that I want to do.
Are we then to expect something much more realistic in the future?
I think my book is perfectly realistic. It's just, my book was real. I hope the thing that I was trying to do is to write something that was very realistic about emotions and feelings, but not necessarily realistic about the physical world. And I think that the book I'm working on now is more realistic in the sense that you're talking about. There's, for one thing, writing about a village 200 years ago allows you all sorts of freedoms because nobody shares that experience. And so you can describe it any way that you want. But if I were to write about New York in 2003, I'm really constrained by what it's like to live in New York in 2003. And I would lose people's sympathy if I started to move too far from it. Because it would no longer feel like something that you could commit yourself to emotionally. And I think I'm more interested now than I was then in writing about what it's like to be alive right now. As I was saying, the way that I wrote about what it's like to be alive now then was to do it through analogy and kind of misdirection, to say, well, being alive now is sort of like this. Maybe feelings that were evoked in this scene in 1790, whatever, are very similar, analogous to feelings that are evoked by life now. But I think now I'm more interested in actually addressing the facts of what it is to be alive now.
Okay, well, we look forward to reading it. So Jonathan's story begins by offering us an optional reality. It was March 18, 1791, when Track and B's double-axle wagon either did or did not pin him against the bottom of the Broad River. From this auspicious beginning comes Jonathan's great-great-great-grandmother, and it's probably not enough greats, but ancestor, named for the River Broad from which she is drawn, like Moses from the reeds. She is a life force, the unexpected life that surfaces from the detritus. She is raised by Yankel D., a disgraced usurer, forced by communal decree to wear around his neck an abacus bead as a sign of his disgrace, with, for me anyway, residences of another American classic. The relationship between Broad and Yankel is breathtakingly beautiful. As a baby, he wraps her in newspaper. Sometimes he would rock her to sleep in his arms and read her left to right and know everything he needed to know about the world. As she grows, quote, she acquired his uneven walk, spoke with his old man's inflections, even rubbed a 5 o'clock shadow that was never at any time of any day of her life there. The love that you depict here is a kind of absorption of one human being into another. Is this true, do you think, of the many kinds of love in this novel?
I think that most kinds of love in the novel are actually unsuccessful, including this one that you're talking about. And that they, with maybe one or two exceptions, maybe Alex's love for his brother is an exception, they must always have to do with one's perception of love and one's desire to love something and give oneself over to something and receive something. And so you pick the best thing that's there, which I think is not how we like to think of love, really. We like to think of love as being not that you walk into a room of 100 people and the person you like most is the one you're in love with. Or you walk onto a planet with 5 billion people and the person you like most is the one you're in love with. That's not really what we think of when we think of love. We think of love as being much more subject to chance than that. That it could have been the case that there was nobody of the 5 billion who you could have loved. And that the existence of that one person is, it's not, definitional, it's really rare. And in this case, the problem that their relationship confronts is that I think they both, the narrator comes to realize anyway, that they love each other because they want to love each other. And they want to love somebody. And they need to be loved by somebody. And I think that's a kind of model that runs throughout the book of what you could look at one way as being extremely successful love, and in another way as being an imitation of love.
Why does Brod tell the Colker that she doesn't love him?
Why do you think? No, I'm serious. I mean, in my opinion, it's because she thinks she doesn't love him. And then she's confronted later, maybe 10 pages later, with a very different scene and a different feeling when he confronts her with a truth that nobody else has confronted her with, that her father isn't her real father. And she says, at that point, I love you. And Alex describes love in one of his letters as being the immovability of truth, that love is when somebody never lies to you. And in the position that he's coming from, that's sufficient, because he has this heritage of lies and of violence and shame and guilt. And it's not clear if in this other world, this imagined world, it's sufficient or not.
Okay. Well, balancing the sweetness of the relationship between Yankel and Brod is a description of the Track and Brod community with its upright synagogue and its slouching synagogue. So, did you mean your swipe at the divisiveness of every Jewish community to be as biting as it actually is?
It sounds like I did better than I even intended, actually. Yeah, I think I did. I don't have any bones to pick with anybody in particular, but there's a certain humor anyway, and the way that things line up, and how I think too many people define themselves in opposition to things rather than in alliance with things.
The criticism is offset, I think, by your description of the circumstances of Jewish life in Europe, with this tug of war between religion and secularism. And it reads like this. The shutters of the shtetl's windows were opening to the commotion, curiosity being the only thing the citizens shared. The accident had happened by the Small Falls, the part of shore that marked the current division of the shtetl into two sections, the Jewish quarter and the human three quarters. All so-called sacred activities, religious studies, kosher butchering, bargaining, etc., were contained within the Jewish quarter. Those activities concerned with the humdrum of daily existence, secular studies, communal justice, buying and selling, etc., took place in the human three quarters. Straddling the two was the upright synagogue. The ark itself was built along the Jewish human fault line, such that one of the two Torah scrolls would exist in each zone. As the ratio of sacred to secular shifted, usually no more than a hair, in this or that direction, save for that exceptional hour in 1764, immediately following the pogrom of beaten chests, when the shtetl was completely secular, so did the fault line, drawn in chalk from Radziwill Forest to the river. And so was the synagogue lifted and moved. It was in 1783 that wheels were attached, making the shtetl's ever-changing negotiation of Jewishness and humanness less of a schlep. Comment?
I think I said it all. No.
Jewishness and humanness?
I guess my only comment is that the book is filled with these different divisions. You know, the shtetl is divided between a Jewish part and a human part. There are lovers who are kept apart because of a wall. There's a house that's actually two houses that's separated by a wall. There's a character who has a saw split right through the middle of his head. And I think that what was happening is that arguments inside of me were playing themselves out in the book. And again, I was at a very, very sensitive time in my life when debates play out, I think maybe more than any other time in one's life. And I was thinking about, what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be human? Is there a difference between the two? Is that preposterous? What does it mean to write in a way that's fictional, and what does it mean to write in something closer to memoir or nonfiction? does it say of me if I'm funny or if I try to be funny? And what does it say of me if I'm serious or try to be serious? And I think that the book itself is this argument writ large. You know, there are two major plots that are interwoven throughout the book that have an almost like schizophrenic difference in tone and subject matter. And I think it's because I couldn't choose.
So you made them blend by superimposing this third strand? Is that how you worked it?
You know, it wasn't until the book was published that it ever occurred to me there was a third strand. People have said, well, this book has three strands. And at first I had no idea what they were talking about. I had always considered Alex's letters to be part of his narrative, just told from a different period in time. So I think there are plenty of reasons in terms of making the book readable and making it more, making the characters more sympathetic, that was necessary. But I didn't think of it as anything extra.
And the choice of fonts, was that yours at the time of writing it, or did that come later? Because that's kind of a dead giveaway.
The italics?
Mm-hmm.
The book just won, by the way, a typographical award. No credit to me. Again, I didn't even consider it. I knew that I didn't. First of all, I knew I didn't want to use different fonts because I think that's kind of cheesy, and I think it's almost like what I can't accomplish through my writing. I can do. Well, this is gonna. We'll wait until my next book comes out before I say any more about that. But I used italics in large part because it gives a feeling that's more fluid than quotation marks. So in the historical sections, all of the things that would have been in quotation marks are in italics because it sort of feels more folkloric and a little bit whimsical. And then for Alex's letter, it's just a kind of tradition that anything that's handwritten, you would use italics for.
Okay. All right, let me read to you how Jews have six senses. Touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, memory. While Gentiles experience and process the world through the traditional senses and use memory only as a second-order means of interpreting events, for Jews, memory is no less primary than the prick of a pin, or its silver glimmer, or the taste of the blood it pulls from the finger. The Jew is pricked by a pin, another illusion, and remembers other pins. It is only by tracing the pinprick back to other pinpricks, when his mother tried to fix his sleeve while his arm was still in it, when his grandfather's fingers fell asleep from stroking his great-grandfather's damp forehead, when Abraham tested the knife point to be sure Isaac would feel no pain, that the Jew is able to know why it hurts. When a Jew encounters a pin, he asks, what does it remember like? The sixth sense is memory, which is, I think, what Jonathan's book is about. It begins with Brod, for whom Yankel has to make up an elaborate past, and it continues with the search for Augustine. Interestingly, both Jonathan and Alex fall in love with her picture, as they fall in love with the past and seek to possess it. Augustine herself, or rather the not Augustine whom they meet, and who turns out to be Lista in Jonathan's story, merging history and fiction, this gets rather complicated, is a repository of the remains of the Jewish shtetl, although at first she denies everything. Denial and memory. It seemed to me that you were talking about two contradictory impulses about the Holocaust.
That's true. Your thoughts are very complete. I don't know that I have so much to say in addition to them. I mean, my own experience has been that the memory of these events that I was ever fed or related came in the form of silence, which I guess is a kind of denial. And it's not to say that to be silent about something is to refuse to remember it. It's just a different kind of remembering. And it requires as much will, and probably more will, than does narrating, telling the events. So in my family, my grandmother is the only direct link to the things that I was writing about. And through her, I guess, my mother. And we never, ever talked about any of this. Absolutely never. But there was a kind of storytelling in the silence. You know, it was not an ignorant silence, and it wasn't a lazy silence. It was a very willful silence, and a silence whose meaning you could understand if you tried to. And it had to do with protecting me. And for them, that was satisfactory to tell the story in that way, but for me, that wasn't satisfactory. And so the same things that I think that they were telling through their silence are what I told through this book.
Do you think that it's ever a successful protection? Do you think that there's a need for the protection?
I'm coming from a different position than they were coming from, than my grandmother was coming from, so it's impossible for me to really say. Not having experienced what she experienced, I think it would be unfair to suggest what she should do. If I were in her position, I think I would probably do exactly what she did and what she does.
Is it true that she, like Jonathan's grandmother, didn't know that you had taken this trip?
Yeah, it is true. I didn't mention it until I'd come back, and then not for a couple weeks or even months, because I don't know what I was afraid of. She would never yell at me, but I was afraid of the silent version of her yelling at me, and or worse, hurting her, which again she would never admit to, but there's a silent version of that too. And I told her, and her first reaction was, "No, you didn't do that. What are you talking about?" I said, "No, I really did. I went, and I can tell you what my experiences were." And she was so happy, really overwhelmingly happy, as happy as I've ever seen her, and wanted to know everything, but there was nothing to tell her because I hadn't talked to her before I went. So I went armed with absolutely no information, no knowledge, no know-how. And I paid the price in my trip, and I came back and had nothing then to report. So then an excerpt of the book was published in the New Yorker, and this was before the book came out.
Right.
So knowing that I had made the trip was one thing, knowing that I'd written about it is another thing. And it wasn't until this excerpt was published that she found out that I had been working on this book about my experiences, and also less directly about her experiences. And it was out for a couple of weeks, and I kept waiting for her to call me. I wasn't going to call her. And eventually she did. And she said, "You know, I read your article, and I liked it very much." And I thought, okay, tension at least immediately relieved, and I don't have to worry, and everything's fine. We probably just won't talk about it. And then she said, "It's not how I would choose to express myself." And that can be taken on a couple different levels, one of which is she doesn't speak English very well. So she reads this and she thinks, you know, his parents paid $30,000 a year for him to go to college to speak like an ignoramus, you know? And I think actually that was what her reaction was. She just didn't get it, really. On the other hand, you know, it's true that the thing that is so wonderful about books, about writing books and about reading books, is that you have an opportunity, a chance to say, that is how I would choose to express myself. The books that I love most are the books that I read and then I say, yeah, that's exactly how I would say it. And it's maybe how I couldn't have said it until this other person said it. Books that I feel like I had written are the ones I like most. And in a way, encountering the opposite of that reaction from her, whether it's what I am applying to it or if that is what she meant, actually invigorated me. It made me feel really excited about the prospect of somebody having the opposite reaction.
So did she choose to speak any more about her experiences after the book was published? I mean, did she want to set the record straight? Did she want to...
She sort of, it's like a faucet situation. You have to turn it on for the water to come out, and I never turned the knob. I think it's a situation in which you can't make the first move exactly, and
she hasn't chosen to.
No, but it's not clear that there's any reason to. In a way, it's obvious and it's almost easy to say, well, you have to talk about these things, and you have to talk about them before you forget them. But clearly, her experiences have had a really indelible impact on my life. And there would be some good from knowing, more of the facts, but there's also some good in respecting a silence and in trying to take the silence, as I did in this book, and make it my own, to retell the story in a way that can now be something that continues to exist.
So in his story, Jonathan creates this very intriguing portrait of his grandfather. I guess since he doesn't have very much information, he is free to make him whatever he wants to make him. And he makes him this sexual prodigy at the age of 10. I guess this was Jonathan's dream, I don't know. Any explanation? I mean, to me, he also was this life force, like Brod, and that was his meaning.
I can tell you at 10 that was not my dream. I mean, at 10 a girl made me want to barf. But I think that the book has to do with desire and longing, and this is one manifestation of desire and longing. And it also has to do with people looking to have desire and longing fulfilled in all the wrong places. And this is another case of that, obviously. He will never be satisfied pursuing this path.
Why does he have this dead arm?
An ant is not an entomologist.
Right. Okay,
I mean, at the risk of deflating every reader in the room, I just wasn't thinking about those things when I wrote the book. And I wouldn't trust myself if I had been. It's not the case that I created a picture and then cut it up into a jigsaw puzzle and put it in a box and presented it to the world and said, could you please try to reassemble my intentions?
You're not a cubist.
No. What I wanted was to make something that between myself and people who read the book, we could almost together work on piecing it together. I don't have particularly romantic notions about an author's role in the world or an author's role in his own or her own books even. One of the things that's been so amazing about publishing a book is that, you were saying, for example, the prick of a pin, and you said that's an illusion. Mm-hmm. So I'm sitting here thinking, I wonder to what? And it doesn't.
Now.
It
No.
does. What in that case did you think it was?
I thought it was Shylock.
No, it actually wasn't in my case. So
Amazing.
The wonderful thing is the book now has that meaning, and I'm sure there are many people who've read the book and have thought exactly what you thought. And it doesn't matter what I think anymore. The book now has all of the intelligence of its readers. It's not limited to my intelligence, and so.
So maybe in a few minutes we'll find out about the dead arm. I mean, there are, 80 people in this room. We may have 80 different versions of the dead arm. Would you like that, or would you rather not?
I mean, it's 8:10 already, so I'm thinking, yeah, that'd be pretty interesting, I suppose.
Well, anyway, Alex doesn't understand this business of the grandfather. He thinks that it's terribly disrespectful, and he questions how Jonathan could depict his grandfather in such an undignified way. Is he right that this portrait lacks dignity?
Well, as I said, I was playing out all sorts of arguments in the book, and one of them is the argument that Alex and Jonathan have. What's the role of truth in writing what does truth even mean? What's the meaning of historical truth as compared to emotional truth? And what are a writer's responsibilities in terms of telling a good story, or in terms of telling a moral story, or an entertaining story? And I didn't have answers, and so I played out my misgivings, right? I played out my questions. And to me, that's a lot more exciting than writing about things you understand. And I wanted my book to pose the questions that I was confronting rather than the answers that at 20 I thought I had come up with. The book ends without any punctuation point. There's no period or question mark or comma. And in part I wanted to imply that it was a conversation, that it was something that wasn't ending, and it wasn't in any way definitive, but was suggestive. In fact, there isn't really even a definitive story in the book, and any attempt to describe it sounds much more confusing than it actually is, in part because it's just the story of talking and telling, and different people arguing with each other and replaying events that happened in some way that we'll never quite know about. We only know the various versions that are applied. So this is what was going on when I wrote the book. I didn't know. I couldn't answer the question that you're asking.
Yeah, and as the book progresses, that becomes more and more interesting, I think. Alex raises a lot of these questions. He says, for example, in a letter to Jonathan, we are being very nomadic with the truth, yes? The both of us. Do you think that this is acceptable when we are writing about things that occurred? If your answer is no, then why do you write about Trachtenbrod and your grandfather in the manner that you do? And why do you command me to be untruthful? If your answer is yes, then this creates another question, which is, if we are to be such nomads with the truth, why do we not make the story more premium than life? It seems to me that we are making the story even inferior. We often make ourselves appear as though we are foolish people, and we make our voyage, which was an ennobled voyage, appear very normal and second-rate. We could give your grandfather 2 arms, and could make him high fidelity. We could give Brod what she deserves in the stead of what she gets. We could even find Augustine, Jonathan, and you could thank her. And grandfather and I could embrace, and it could be perfect and beautiful and funny and usefully sad, as you say. We could even write your grandmother into your story. This is what you desire, yes? Which makes me think that perhaps we could write grandfather into the story. Perhaps, and I'm only uttering this, we could have him save your grandfather. He could be Augustine, August perhaps, or just Alex, if that is satisfactory to you. I do not think that there are any limits to how excellent we could make life seem. And it's at that point, I think, that it's quite clear that the demarcation, between history and fiction, it's a very fluid line. So I thought that you're saying that memory may merge with fiction, but even if it's fiction, that there is something redemptive about it. Alex writes to Jonathan about his grandfather, and he says, grandfather is not a bad person, Jonathan. Everyone performs bad actions. I do, father does, even you do. A bad person is someone who does not lament his bad actions. Grandfather is now dying because of his. I beseech you to forgive us and to make us better than we are. Make us good. Well, in any event, the link between the past and the future is clear. There's this wonderful scene, I loved it, in 1968. The astronauts pass over the lunar horizon at Trachtenbrod, and what do they see but the glow of the lovemaking of Brod and the Kolker. The title Illumination is the title of one of the last chapters. And of course, it refers on one level to the fire in the synagogue in which all the Jews perish. Alex's grandfather turns in his best friend, Herschel, so that he might save his son. His son grows up to be a brutal and despicable human being. And I think that the moral irony there is not wasted on the reader. The grandson, Alex, turns the father out of the house, thus redeeming the grandfather's betrayal? What do you think? Is forgiveness possible in the third generation? That's really my question.
And there's a difference between asking, is forgiveness possible in this book in the third generation, is forgiveness possible in life in the third generation? Because in life, I'm not an expert. You know, it's such an, it's a question that I could really only answer for myself. In the book, it's certainly what everybody is striving toward. And I think the book has a kind of redemptive note at the end. It's an ironic redemptive note in that it comes at the hands of a tragic act. But there's a kind of trope throughout the book of I will. You know, from the very beginning, all these documents float to the surface of the river, and one of them is a resolution that says I will, I will. And from that point, it becomes a little peg on which the stories of the book are hung, various pegs throughout the book. And it ends on those words, I will, I will. Mm-hmm. And I think the movement through the book is from questioning to acting. And that movement has always attracted me. And I think, in a way, it's the story of all literature. Hamlet probably being the best example. And that the final act is supposedly the redemptive act. In this case, it's an ambiguous act. And that's why the title, Everything is Illuminated, can work both ways. Because in one sense it is. Everything is illuminated. Everything is made clear. We didn't know something in the beginning, and we know it at the end. There was a kind of moral uncertainty in the beginning, and there's a certainty at the end. And the characters, particularly Alex, are resolute and are moving forward in a way that is fitting. But in another sense, really nothing is illuminated, because the book ends in a more ambiguous place than it began, and there are more question marks at the end than we had at the beginning. And it's not clear exactly what the grandfather meant with this final act, and it's not clear at all what it is that Alex is going to do with what has happened and what direction his life will take.
So you said before that for yourself you can answer whether forgiveness is possible in the third generation. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, the funny thing about forgiveness is there's no direction in which it isn't working. You know, I have to forgive the people who have to forgive me. It's almost always that way, I think. And in my case, I found that I think I felt that my intentions were good when I wrote the book. At that point in my life, I felt that I wasn't deceitful with my family, that I was loving, that things that went wrong were not born out of laziness, and they weren't born out of ill will, but out of just these irreconcilable familial situations. Things line up in families such that it is not the case that everyone can have what he wants. It's not the case that everyone can be happy. It doesn't say anything poor about the participants. It says something poor about the makeup of the world. That's just the way it is. And at that point in my life, I felt pretty frank about those things. And when I wrote the book, I wasn't intending to write a book that would be received in any particular way. I wasn't intending to write a book that was in any way structurally interesting or even entertaining. I was trying to express this frankness and trying to express gratitude and apologies.
But it is a Holocaust novel in some ways, right?
In certain ways, but it's also, a road trip novel in some ways, and
Sure.
a fear of animals novel in some ways.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up because I have no idea what this dog is doing.
Has anybody heard
Somebody
of?
told me that I'm just not an animal lover, and it's clear.
Well, then we could see eye to eye. Does anybody know what the Wayne Brady Show is, by any chance? It's this show, and it's this like relatively young guy, host, young black guy. And the other day, someone told me they were watching, and he said, "I'd like to bring out my dog, Sammy Davis Jr. Jr." And this is the moment at which you think, either this book is doing awesome, or I guess I was accidentally plagiarizing, or Wayne Brady and I share some sort of makeup,
So did you follow up?
Well, I don't know. What, can I write him a letter or something? I don't know what to do.
Absolutely.
Well, my lawyer's
I wanna
working on it
know.
anyway.
I would think so. But going back to the Holocaust theme. So my question, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but I read this as a statement saying that, the young generation, meaning yours, the third generation, can reach some sort of a rapprochement. That enough already.
I think the statement is yours and not mine, and that's the way it should be. I don't think that writers should write with statements. I think that's actually ridiculous, and that writers should write from a position of expressing. This is who I am and this is what I'm like. And then if you look at that and say, well, here's my interpretation of what this person is and what he's like. He is saying these things, then that's a good communication that we've had. But I think the relationship between writers and readers is conversing, it's not teaching.
But it's a one-way communication unless you tell me something about this subject, other than the novel, because...
Well, I would say two things.
It's a sort of silence.
I would say two things in response. One of which is it doesn't actually feel one way. Or at least when I read books that I love, just the way that I read. Maybe, I think it says something about the books you're reading. Maybe you haven't read a book yet that inspires you to feel that way. It's like I was saying, it wasn't until I'd read Love in the Time of Cholera that I felt a certain way about literature. And in large part, I wrote this book because I wasn't feeling that way enough. I wasn't feeling that there was something that I could confuse for my own. So I wrote something of my own. The other thing that I would say about your comment is that my function in the world isn't to be really a personality. It's not to reveal things. My life in itself is not all that interesting, actually. I think ideally, or in the best case, the things that I write about can be interesting and can be worth discussing in a way that maybe my life never could be. So it's true that without my saying anything about the book, you will never know a certain take on the book, but I don't think anything great is lost. And in fact, I think the more I talk about the book, the less the book can be for you, because it becomes very hard to disagree with me. If I tell you something that I intended it to be in a certain way, I know from my own experience as a reader that I start to think that that's how it is, when in fact that's not how it is, because there is that Shylock illusion, even though I didn't intend it.
I understand, but on the other hand, might you not open up another way for me to look at it and make it even richer?
Sometimes.
And I would welcome that.
Yeah, no, I think sometimes it's true. That's why these things are nice, and that's why I like to participate.
That's why you're here.
That's why I'm here, because I think there's good in it. It's not to say that I should never say anything about the book, but I think I've noticed that there are certain kinds of questions that are constraining and certain kinds that are liberating, certain kinds that spark a conversation and certain kinds that end a conversation. And so I always get nervous about the kinds that might end a conversation.
I hope that's not the case here.
No. Listen to me talking.
All right, so I'd like you to consider the following reading. One of the last chapters in Jonathan's novel takes place as the Nazis enter Trachenbrod. And the last passage is written by the river Brod, which witnesses the destruction of the Jews. And another baby is almost born within its waters, but not quite. This is the child that Jonathan's grandfather has lost. He's lost a family, and then he comes to America, I guess, and begins a new one. So this is the child that is lost. It does not survive. It cannot survive because you are saying that history cannot be entirely reenacted. It has to start anew. And it starts anew with a new Safran family in America, and it starts anew with a new Perchoff family purged of its betrayal and its brutality. In other words, we do get another chance. We are not condemned to repeat history, even if we don't remember it in all its details.
I think that we're condemned to retell history, not necessarily to relive history. And there's a kind of curse in that too. You know, the original scene of this wagon going into the river is replayed maybe 10 times throughout the book in all sorts of different forms. You know, in conversation, on the stage of a theater, and it's this inescapable beginning. The first chapter, I think the name of that chapter is The Beginning of the World Often Comes.
I think so. Mm-hmm.
And there's this sense in the book of this perpetual renewal and recreation, but it's always founded in a kind of retelling. And that's exactly, you know, this book is that. I am not condemned to history. And this book is not a repetition of history, but it is an act of retelling. And there's a sense in which I was bound, and there's a sense in which I was completely free. And I think the book itself plays out both of those destinies.
So now I would be very happy if you would all jump in and tell us what you think of the dead arm and other such things. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm not going to tell what I think of the dead arm. I really was intrigued by your last comment, which is there's a sense when you feel bound and a sense free. Because, by the way, I think the book was brilliant, and I think that a significant part of its brilliance was that I didn't feel you ever felt bound. And I wonder where you felt bound, because I surely never felt that constraint in anything you did.
There's a character in the book who once, his fate is described as being, he's a perfectly unique link in a perfectly uniform chain. And I think that kind of paradox is what I'm talking about. I think that I can have, you know, complete expressive freedom and still be part of a tradition. You know, I'm pretty clearly part of a tradition. And there are inspirations that you could name, you know, with some ease, I think. And it's not a coincidence that I am a young Jewish American writing about this subject matter. There's a reason I'm doing it. It's not only because I think it's really interesting and fertile. It's in part because I'm sort of bound to it. I can't escape who I am. I'm always going to be somebody, the product of my upbringing. And that's something I can't choose for or against. But then what I do with it and what I make of it is where I'm unbound.
Yes.
A friend of mine who has a PhD in Yiddish literature felt that he couldn't be here, but was curious because she said that this book seemed to be very well researched as far as Yiddish folk tales and history. And so I have a question as to whether that's true, whether you did a lot of research. And as far as the dead arm, I am currently reading Love in the Time of Cholera, and immediately saw the parallel with Florentino Ariza and multiple lovers, especially widows, and he's pitied also because of his appearance. But I don't know if it's...
I actually don't remember. I mean, it's possible, it's even likely. I just don't remember. In terms of research, it's kind of the damnedest thing, actually. I get really confused because I don't remember having done any research. In fact, I'm sure I did no research. And I'm positive that I read, I mean, I have read all of this stuff since, but I read it since. And I read Isaac Babel after I wrote the book, and I read Singer after I wrote the book. And I read them and I said, wow, this is what I was alluding to that whole time. But then that's not how illusion works. It works in the other direction. You read it first and then you allude to it. And so I had this problem of figuring out how that information got to me, if not through my eyes. And my best answer, my only answer, is through conversation and the tone of what we talked about at the dinner table when I was a kid, the kinds of stories my parents told me. Maybe all those years at Hebrew school weren't a complete and total waste.
Yes.
I'm a language teacher. I don't teach Hebrew, but as a language teacher, I was enthralled with the way in which you captured a foreigner learning English. And I've spoken to many Russian people, and they have a lot of these ways of expressing themselves, not only Russians, but people who were trying to learn English. Did you sit there with a dictionary or a thesaurus and come up with some of these wonderful words that, were at once brilliant? Because the book is really, to me, also about how difficult it is to learn a foreign language, how difficult it is to get the idiomatic expressions, mostly, the nuances of another language, because that's what I'm trying to do with my students. So I thought it was just brilliant, just as a study in language, That's what I have to say.
Thank you. I think the book, to me, is about not necessarily the difficulty with language is an example, a symptom of what the book is about, which is the difficulty of expression. And Alex is the caricature of this problem in the book. But in fact, everybody in the book has a problem with saying what it is that he wants to say. In fact, Jonathan has a much bigger problem than does Alex. It's just that it's not funny and it doesn't draw attention to itself. And it usually comes in the form of silence. One thing you mentioned was that we never see Jonathan's letters. In fact, we know almost nothing about him. Right. I didn't know anybody who spoke like Alex, and I've received, at this point, a couple letters from linguists who have said this is not what somebody learning a language would speak like. But the point is not that it should replicate. It doesn't have to be like a facsimile of what someone in Alex's position would be like. It has to evoke the feelings of what someone in Alex's position, the feelings that he would evoke. And this is the funny thing about writing, is that sometimes the best way to make something feel real is not to present it as itself, but to present things that are like it, that are suggestive of it. And you have to make certain mistakes in order to get at a different kind of accuracy. Because if I had written Alex like Alex really talks, in addition to the fact that he would have been pretty boring, I don't think he would have even been believable. And that's sort of another, maybe a possible reason, I'm just thinking aloud now, why I would use my own name and fictionalize myself, is because in order to present myself accurately, which has got to be a writer's goal, it was at least my goal, it's not the case that I can best do that by just presenting myself. I sometimes have to present things that evoke feelings like the feelings I evoke, or move at different kinds of angles and show the shadows of things rather than just the thing. There's a scene when a bird flies through a window. There's an illusion there. Maybe you picked it up, maybe not. And it leaves a hole of the shape of itself, a silhouette in the window. And it's remarked that the shape left in the window is greater evidence of that bird's existence than the bird ever was. And that's what a lot of writing has to do with, just that you trace around something and you show the environment that it exists in, and by so doing, that's how you describe the thing.
Yes, back, please.
Yeah, I have a question, but it's sort of rhetorical and personal. What if the faucet that your grandmother is just waiting for to be turned on is just your saying to her that you're ready to hear the non-silence? And you don't have to answer.
But when, well, that may be the case, and that probably is the case. But I mean, there's a part in the book when the Jonathan and his grandmother would scream these words off the porch, and Jonathan doesn't understand what they mean. And Alex says, "Well, why didn't you ask her?" And Jonathan says, "Well, because I didn't really want to, or I didn't know how to." And Alex says, "Well, what if she is screaming, 'Ask me what I'm screaming,' and you're not asking her, so she could tell you, 'Ask me.'" And there's a kind of cyclicality in all of this, that one wants to be asked so that one can respond, "Please ask me."
Yes.
I found the river, the water and the flow was like your thoughts, and the tide, and almost I could see that as equal to the illumination, because it gave me a lot of flow and natural part. It grounded me. Was the river ever intended to be symbolic in your thoughts of genesis of coming, going, and anger, etc.?
Well, again, I didn't really intend anything. I think what's true is that one feels things very deeply and expresses them, and that the things that one feels organize themselves into symbols and stories and characters. In a way, all of the work is done before you do it. It's just the effort you make is just to get it onto the page. A river is the kind of thing that it's impossible for it not to be a symbol. In the case of my book, I think it's actually a pretty heavy symbol, maybe even to a fault. It marks a division, it marks a place of rebirth, especially. And it probably, like you're suggesting, has something to do with the style of the book, with like a current and something that is very forcibly moving.
I found it moving more so than the illumination, because that carried me. And I didn't know whether at the end that was supposed to carry me into a peaceful setting or push me out again to think again. And I didn't know how you wanted us as a reader to feel at the end of the book. What kind of current did you feel us to have or want us to have?
I didn't really think about it in those terms. Again, I didn't have any point I was trying to convey. I didn't have any moral. I didn't have any...
What did you feel then? Can I ask you that?
What did I feel at the end of the book? What's that?
Relief.
No, not really.
Well, no, you said you were trying to express your feelings as who you are, or you were Jew. Did you feel that you found the answer to those questions? Because obviously there's some voice hidden in there that wrote this book that had other intentions than, you know...
I think that the answer is that you don't have to choose, that there can be a coexistence of these two things. The town sustained itself with the river running through it. The person survives with a saw blade in the middle of his head. The double house is functional. People carry on a love affair with the wall between them. And I wrote the book, and the book is not a problem. The book is a sort of healthy being in my life, not something that needs to be fixed. And so I think what I realized is that, you know, the wagon did or didn't go in the river. Did it go or didn't go? Well, it did or didn't go. That's the answer. And that's the final answer.
I have two questions. One is, which $30,000 college did you go to? And was Jonathan kosher, and he didn't want to tell them that he was kosher, that he was an observant Jew, that he didn't want to eat the meat?
Right.
Right? And why didn't Alex want to be called Alex? Even though, I mean, everybody was an Alex. Why did he pick this other name?
Okay. Well, the ones that I can answer best are, I went to Princeton. And was Jonathan kosher? Probably. It's sort of interesting, probably. I mean, he talks, meat is an issue and sausage is a funny issue. And so whether or not he is or isn't, probably he is.
Rather than vegetarian, okay?
Right. Now, why does Alex not want to be called Alex? This is, like, to me, and I even imagine to you, I would so much prefer to hear other people's opinions on this one, because I imagine there's some conflicting opinions that are really interesting and much more interesting than mine.
Well, I loved Alex.
Why do you think he was called Alex? He didn't want to be called Alex.
He was trying to break away from the mold. I mean, this was like his father was Alex, his grandfather was Alex, everybody was Alex. He wanted to be different. And by becoming friends with Jonathan, reading the book, I felt that he had like a hold, like he had his vision that maybe someday he'll go to America and Jonathan will help him come to America and he'll have a different life and he can be this other person, whatever the name was that he picked. And I think that really happens. I remember one time I was in Germany and I was befriended by this one particular person and like he wanted to write me, you know, when I went to America, and I had that kind of feeling like, okay, you made a friend and, well, does he want to be a friend because he wants to change his life and live, you know, what you're doing. So that's how I kind of felt that way with Alex.
I find it amusing that you said the line, the throwaway line, that your Hebrew school education wasn't a complete and total waste, because
you're a Hebrew school teacher.
You're just a rabbi.
There you go.
Because the book, which I enjoyed immensely, shows real nuance, depth of knowledge, and you clearly demonstrate that you are more than doing research on Jewish practice and ritual. The example of the shtetl abundantly shows that to be the case. So I'm gonna, although I have many questions about intention that I want to ask, I respect your decisions and choices here. I have two questions related to this. First of all, I'd like to hear more about your Jewish background and not just the cultural aspects, but more of the religious or educational pieces here, where that comes from. And where have you been with that? I'd be curious. And also, I'm really impressed, Jonathan, with the wisdom and the phrases you're using. Not just the type of phrases, but the real life wisdom which you are sharing. And as a fellow younger person, I'm curious to what you attribute your ability at a younger age, and again, as a younger person, if I can say this, to really speak in a way that reflects a life with texture and maturity and a sense of, you speak about your 19 years old as if it was many, many years ago. So I wonder to what you attribute that type of ability to really reflect and see that.
Well, I can answer your first question. I grew up in D.C. and I went to Gan Hayeled Nursery School, and then I went to public school for a while, and I went to Hebrew school once a week, and I continued doing Hebrew school once a week through my bar mitzvah, and then I went for another, year or two before it just petered out. And my relationship with Judaism since then has been largely cultural. I don't go to synagogue but once or twice a year. I'm not kosher. It's actually, it's funny, like, I haven't been kosher for a long time, and yet I really, you want to talk about, being bound, how I'm bound, I find it hard to say. It's weird, even though I had calamari just, half an hour ago, I think I have a very conflicted relationship with it, a very divided relationship, and that there's a very strong part of me that very strongly resists things that are explicitly Jewish. And there's a very strong part of me that's very strongly drawn to things that are... It's an ever-changing negotiation of Jewishness and humanity. But I know that I can't escape the material for some reason, and that I find it really more beautiful to me and more rich to me than any other material that I could write from. It's probably because it's what I grew up with, and it's what my imagination, it's sort of my imagination was formed in that environment.
Yes.
There's so much going on in this story, and as we said, there are several threads. Did you envision the whole book before you wrote it, or where did it come from? How did it evolve?
I did not envision the whole book when I started it. In fact, when I started it, I didn't even know that I was starting a book. The first sentence originally was, it's the first sentence of the second chapter now, which is, it was March 18th, 1791. And there's a single sentence in the whole book that is inspired by research that I actually did, and that's the sentence. Because the village that I went to was called Trachenbrod, and there is a river running through it called the Broad River, and the folklore of the town has it. It was named for this Gentile Trachem whose wagon flipped and he drowned in the river. And so I thought, well, what a positively awesome way to start a book. You know, this guy drowns, it's a little bit of death, it's a little bit of life. You know, you touch on all the big themes in one sentence. And so I wrote it. And then I thought, well, I don't know. It'd be kind of nice if the guy got away. You know, why do I have to drown somebody in the first sentence? What's that all about? Or even better would be if we didn't know if he drowned, if there's the possibility of escape. And that was more exciting to me. Potential was more exciting to me than any sort of definitive story. And so I rewrote it as it is written now. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. Actually, I did a little research here, and this is how the town was named. And so maybe I have some sort of obligation to write it as it was, an obligation to the village, or an obligation to historical accuracy, or an obligation to my relatives. And I went back and forth many, many times with this one sentence. And ultimately I decided on what you read, which is potential. It did or didn't go in. And not really knowing and being uncertain. And the rest of the book really was born out of that decision. I decided to just pursue what felt authentic rather than what was, by historical standards, authentic. And
But just from that one sentence, did you know it was going to be a Jewish book?
well, I think once I knew that I was writing it all about a shtetl, there was no way of getting around.
No, but I mean, you could have taken that scenario and gone anywhere with it.
I never considered going anywhere with it other than where I did. Yeah.
Is that the only part of it that's true?
It's the only part.
Except for the present thing.
Yeah, that's the only part.
So that's all you knew. Everything else is fiction.
Just made up.
Did you know that you were a writer before you wrote that?
Not when I was a kid, but when I had written other things before I wrote the book. I'd written some stories, I'd written some longer pieces. But this, I was very, very conscious as I was writing the book that this was my first book. I knew that. And it felt really special for that reason.
I thought I read somewhere that you were a student of Joyce Carol Oates. Is that correct, at Princeton?
Yeah, I took a writing class with her.
Was she influential in any way?
Yeah, extremely influential. Probably more influential than anyone else has been in terms of writing for me.
Joyce Carol was.
She was the first person to ever tell me that my writing was good. And
well, that helps.
And that meant something to me.
Yeah.
And she gave me every reason to think that's what I should do with my life.
With some of the Gothic elements in her fiction, do you like that?
Do I like it? I think there's a way in which I could answer this question by saying yes. And she wrote a letter to me when I was a student of hers, and she said, you know, we've discussed your work in class. I want to discuss it out of class. Here's what I think you should be reading. And it was like really heavy Gothic stuff, you know. Mm-hmm. Like Hawthorne was the lightest thing on the list. And I thought, well, I wonder why she would think that. You know, just from listening to me, I'm sure none of you think I'm a particularly dark Gothic person. But she has a certain sense of what has value, and a very, very strong sense. And that's what makes her a great person and a great artist, regardless of whether or not I share that sense.
So I understand the film rights have been bought. And I read that Lieb Schreiber was going to be making the film. Now, I don't know whether he's directing, producing, starring. Can you tell us a little more?
He's doing it.
He's doing all of it?
Makeup, refreshments. Yes, so Liev Schreiber bought the film rights, and I don't know if you're familiar with him, anybody?
Yes.
I think he's a pretty good person to do it. He's really smart, and he's a very, very good actor, and he cares a lot about this subject matter. He was not in a position in which he was necessarily ready to do this. He wasn't searching around for something to make a movie out of. This just spoke to him strongly enough to justify stopping everything else.
So I read that he was off in the Ukraine somewhere looking
You read
for
that?
location.
That's true. He's a hard guy to track down. I'm not exactly sure where he is.
How do you feel about a movie being made of this book? I mean, this is yours.
Right.
Well, it's partly mine now, too, and
That's
everybody
right.
else in the room. I know that, but...
He wrote the screenplay also. I think I'll believe it when I see it, and I'll confront it when I see it, and I'll worry about it when I see it.
Good for you.
Until then, you know.
Post the adaptation until then.
Yeah.
It doesn't make you nervous.
We'll go to war with Iraq before this movie comes out.
Has he started to work on it yet?
He's written it. He's written
Just
it.
written it, but he hasn't actually started producing it, right?
Right.
So back to the arm.
Yes. Yes, please.
I think, Jonathan, that you're incredibly modest about the way in which you've integrated the symbolism of Western culture and the iconography and how you can play it back in a person's story. And I think bravo to you for having written such a spectacular contemporary piece about your own story. Like the other woman, I'm curious about, language obviously is a vehicle of your story, and so it's a subject of the story as well. And you play with language so interestingly in Alex's letters. I mean, words like "we roosted there for a long time." How did you make these choices to startle us about our own idiom, to show how language is so essential to communication, and how Alex seems to get more fluid, as he says, when he comes closer to the truth. Am I right in feeling it? I was angry in the beginning because it's real frustrating reading him and yet funny. But later on, I wasn't caught up. I wasn't caught short by his word.
I think that as I wrote him, my understanding of why I was writing him developed. And it started because he was funny, and I really enjoyed it. And then I started to sympathize with him very strongly, and in large part because of the way he speaks. And that's because of something I was saying before, that he has this problem with expression. And as a writer, I think I was familiar with that. It's the funny thing about writing is the more you write, the more you realize the impossibility of what you're doing, and the more you realize the necessity of what you're doing. That you start by thinking, well, I'm going to say it all, and then you say, well, I could say half of it, that would be good. And then you think a quarter of it wouldn't even be bad. And at a certain point, you're like, if I said 1,000th of it, I would be really fulfilled. And then you think, but wait a minute, 1,000th is a very small portion of it. And is it worth giving over my life to say 1,000th of it if I'm lucky? And you think, well, 1,000th of it is a lot more than 0. So I guess I've got to work for 1,000th of it. And I think Alex suffers this problem too of He wants to say the whole thing, and he's incapable. Like us, he doesn't have a large enough vocabulary. And so he sounds ridiculous, and it's funny at first, and then he just sounds kind of sad. And I found that the more I wrote him, the more physical and forceful and emotional it was. It was like continually, he's butting his head into a wall, the wall that separates him from being able to show his true self.
No, but what about your specific choices, the synonyms, so to speak, that you choose for him? Does it follow a pattern? And
Well,
that, laughing at our own idiom or calling us up to recognize how foolish the idiom is in the first place, or how limited the idiom is, and it only addresses a certain number of people who can understand it?
all I can say is I feel like I was born with a little bit of Alex in me. Like I spoke Alex fluently before I wrote the book. So it wasn't a tremendous effort. In the beginning it was hard because I had to get my it's probably a lot like reading it. In the beginning you're frustrated, you got to get your footing, and then at a certain point you can speak Alex. Now the funny thing about him is if it's not done right, it sounds really awful. And one thing that happens very frequently is someone will come up, most often they'll just say, "Hey, premium book guy." And you're like, well, great, you're very original, that's smart. But sometimes somebody will say like, "Radical book," and I'm just like, why would you say that? He would not say that. And the fact of the matter is, the goof-ups are very, very specific, and I can't explain where they come from. But I know that I made a lot of missteps before I got to where I was. And, you know, there were probably 3 times as many jokes in the first draft as there are now, because I just got it wrong a lot of the time. And sorting through it, you see, well, this sounds sort of like what Alex would do, and this sounds like what Alex would do. And it was intuitive. It had nothing to do with anything a thesaurus could teach me or observing students studying for English as a second language could teach me. It was just intuitive. Alex's?
Well, the play.
Wait, I'm sorry, I don't even think
play, yeah, the play. With the phonies.
Humorous, he says, is the only truthful way to tell a sad story. So I would like to end on that note because I think it kind of encapsulates the whole novel for me. Thank you very much, Jonathan Safran Foer. A pleasure to meet you. Good luck.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.